And whether figures released this week help or hinder, I'm not sure, George, but can you explain when figures are released that show that the budget deficit is not quite as bad as we thought, and yet overall it's not good news?
Well, we're down a couple of billion because we didn't spend as much as we thought we would in the last financial year. This is 10-11, pardon me. But revenue's down again. And revenue, if it's down again, it means the starting point for the 12-13 year, which is the one we're all interested in, it's going to be a lot harder to get to surplus.
Well, Wayne Swan, nevertheless, thinks it's still achievable. That's the target. Here he is.
I'm quite happy to talk at some length about what is happening internationally, but in terms of our budget, I repeat our determination to come back to surplus in 2012-13, and I'll just make this very clear point. We will deal with the cards when they're dealt. These events have got some way to play out.
So, Lenore, explain the degree of difficulty now.
Degree of difficulty very, very high, sort of triple backflip with Pike almost. But I think the almost vaguely ridiculous thing about this is that we're all obsessed with will they or won't they in 2012-13, in that it doesn't really matter. I mean, yes, we should cut government spending. Yes, it's important to be frugal, etc., etc. But it doesn't really matter if you're slightly in the red or slightly in the black in that particular year. And some of the information and the debate that's going into this tax forum next week actually really paints in quite stark relief the longer-term, bigger picture problem, which is really huge, which is that whether we get into surplus for about 5 or 6 years, that's fine. But once you get past that, we're living beyond our means. We need to reform the tax system. And if we don't do both those things, there are major, major deficits coming up that our kids are going to inherit. And that needs to be dealt with now. And in a way, that's a much bigger problem than whether Wayne Swan gets there in 12-13 or not.
Isn't this another example of politics creating these kind of short-term traps? I mean,
Exactly.
with Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan, because of the pressure around them, you know, media pressure and campaign pressure and so on, take a decision to say, well, look, it's going to be an ironclad guarantee that we're going to be in surplus by then, or there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, you know, to kind of keep the debate under control.
Tony Abbott writing a pledge, there'll be no industrial relations reform. That's locked him in.
So you spend a lot to get short-term sort of peace, and then you create a long-term rod for your own back, and you've got this weird situation where no matter what global calumny is visited upon the Australian economy, Wayne Swan, you know, has to cling to this bit of driftwood.
Will live or die on whether he gets there in that year.
Win the day and lose the forward estimates. Sorry, ask your question.
As Shakespeare said.
The term that Lenore uses, and so does the Business Council, is tax reform. But when you've got $50 billion or something to find, you've got to cut your expenditure. But by tax reform, they mean increased taxes, don't they?
Well, they mean
otherwise, how do you bridge the shortfall?
What they actually mean, and this is quite an interesting debate, if Wayne Swan will allow the participants on Tuesday and Wednesday to have it. Taxes are supposed to grow in line with the economy because spending grows in line with the economy. So basically, if you can keep up with GDP on your tax base, you're not really causing too much trouble on the spending side of the budget. Now, something as simple as the GST, notwithstanding the fact that it goes to the states, it's all the same bucket of money in the end. The GST is half a percentage point, $7.5 billion in today's dollars, half a percentage point of GDP weaker than it was at the peak of its revenue powers just after tax reform came in. So the GST isn't keeping up with the economy. And the GST does not belong to Wayne Swan. It is Peter Costello's baby. The income tax system has a huge hole in it because all these tax cuts were awarded during mining boom Mark 1 on the assumption that China would keep giving us an extra $20 billion a year forever. Now, of course, when the global recession hit, we didn't get it, but everybody else did. Our income clock was reset. We're down, as Wayne Swan points out in these things, about $40 to $50 billion a year in revenue. Revenue that we assumed in Peter Costello's day and in Wayne Swan's first budget will be there forever. It's not there now. It'll come back in time.
But
in the meantime, if you're looking, especially with this, as Annabelle and Lenore point out, this artificial deadline of a 2012-13 surplus, if there's a double dip in the global economy, there is no 2012-13
But it might be artificial,
surplus.
but it's deadly politically now.
Of course it's deadly, but then again, the problem this government had is it actually inherited a big structural hole in the budget, but it couldn't prove it when it still had a $20 billion paper surplus. Of course, when it went to a $50-odd billion deficit, now the stimulus does not explain how you went from a $20 billion paper surplus to a $50 billion deficit, because stimulus is only about 10 or 15 billion a year. They weren't able to tell the Australian electorate, look, Costello spent the winnings before we received them. Now, this was a mandatory pre-commitment, by the way, to tax cuts that were unaffordable, but both sides signed up to them, and now we've got the problem.
But the other thing that the tax forum may well not show that we don't have the wit to solve is that there are some, whether you have to increase taxes or not, there are some taxes that are less efficient and some taxes that are more efficient. The problem is that a lot of the bad ones, the less efficient ones, are the ones the states get, and the states raise so little of their own money that they don't want to let go of them even if they are inefficient. So things like stamp duty, which just stops people from being flexible in terms of where they run their business or where they live, payroll tax, tax on employment, you know, how smart is that? But to actually reform those taxes and replace them with more efficient taxes that don't act as an impediment on growth requires cooperation between the federal and state governments.
And then, of course, everything that comes out of this tax summit, forum.
Just on that point.
Drinks and nibbles, or whatever it's now called.
Before you go on, let's have a look at this event. I think we'll call it of next week, because I've got the definition of a summit here, and a summit is a meeting of leaders usually called to shape a program of action. Whereas a forum is a public meeting for open discussion. It's merely a voicing of ideas. So what term do you think Wayne Swan is using? Here's Wayne Swan.
I don't see this as being a thing where everyone sits down and they all put up their hands and say yay or nay. It's not like that. It's a forum. I know a lot of people have wanted to run around and call it other names. It is simply a forum for people to get up and various organisations to talk about what their priorities are. At the end of the day, the government will assess all that and we'll move on the priorities that we outline. Well, there's already lots of documents being produced for the forum.
Your point?
Well, you know, I mean, the point is that this isn't really their event, is it? Like the government. It's something they agreed to during the long negotiation with the crossbenchers.
Along with the carbon tax, poker machine reform.
Yeah, to have this summit. Back then it was still being referred to by those misty-eyed fools as a summit. I mean, it's kind of like going on a date that's been organised by your parents. You know, you kind of turn up, you be polite, but there'll be nothing unexpected occurring and everyone will be home by 9 p.m. Like, that's kind of the...
Because to do tax reform you need political capital, and they're in political deficit big time, and so they just kind of need to get through it. It's more like a wine and cheese night, you know.
So it's got to be revenue neutral, right? Anything that comes out of this has got to be revenue neutral. I mean...
George, any expectations at all?
Well, just at the risk of firing up all your viewers, I'd like to put in a good word for Rob Oakeshott. This isn't a bad idea to have this forum, summit, GabFest, because this government needs to confront the structural hole in the budget. And if it has to be dragged kicking and screaming by the BCA, the AIG, the ACTU, which is pointing these things out, all well and good.
I agree with you, and I also think if something comes out of it, it might be just that talking about tax reform is on the agenda again and can be done again, and that would be a good thing.
I agree with you with the gas in the tank thing, and one of the, you know, one of the millions of unusual things, I suppose, that's happened in the last couple of years in federal politics is that you've got a situation now where this government has their carbon pricing scheme in the parliament, and it's kind of assumed the de facto status of a tax reform. I mean, it is a new tax according to everybody's agreed nomenclature. So it's almost as if the government has kind of fiddled with the tax system. I think that's the perception.